New Junk City by Thomas Bradford. The Earth was wasted. The population lived in giant domes that protected them from the harsh winds and darkened skies of the outside world, the onset of technology during the previous century having not stopped, but slowed to a crawl. It was a place where a select few thrived. The impoverished were everywhere, huddled in the streets, sleeping under archways wrapped in decaying blankets, sitting among the trash and discarded machinery as they tried desperately to drown out the noise of the city. Neon and metal moved in the streets. Robotic forms kept their mindless tasks among the rundown storefronts, while litter drifted along the pavement like tumbleweeds, or signs of the time. New Junction City. New Junk City, most called it. The slow but inexorable march of technology had left the growing population of humanity behind, with many too poor to afford the escape of artificial realities, save those from the end of a syringe or the neck of a bottle. Jonathan Derringer was more fortunate than most, but not by much. Living in a hole-in-the-wall apartment on the city's south side, John was always one step away from joining those lost souls stuck in the streets. Like others facing the bottom, he had turned to a life of crime, using his tech smarts to get freelance work with various clients, usually two-bit thieves or those sniffing for anything to use for a leg up, namely blackmail. He was good at his job, but so were many others. The competitive market often made it a struggle to make ends meet. Synthetic eyes were a must, as was the jack in his head. The wet wire alone, along with the necessary software, had cost him a pretty penny. Most of his equipment was years old, but still did the trick just fine. Sitting in front of a small monitor, perched atop of what had once been a school desk in times past, he stared at live footage from a point-of-view camera. The wet wire dangled from a hole behind his right ear, connecting to a large tower beneath the desk. Text and schematics floated across his eyeballs as he stared vacantly, typing on a keyboard with one hand, the other holding a paper cup containing soda that had gone flat hours ago. He sipped it through a straw, hardly noticing the disintegrated paper that had seeped into the soda's flavor. One blink. His eyes cleared at once. He took another sip, then spoke into a small microphone. "Security cams are down, Ermac." The view on the display focused on a mounted camera at the end of a dark corridor. John noted its green light was dark as it panned slowly back and forth. Ermac's point of view turned to his team, and he motioned them forward. Rounding the corner, they approached an elevator. "Take it to 16, John instructed them, but as soon as it passes 15, hit stop." "Copy that," Ermac grunted. The group crowded into the elevator. John held his breath as the view on the monitor showed the rising floor numbers. 13, 14, 15, and stop. Ermac's hand hit the red button. The elevator ceased its ascent. "Okay," Ermac said. "Now what?" "Open the doors." Ermac hit the open button, but the doors remained shut. He jabbed it repeatedly to no result. "All right," he said, his deep voice frustrated. "We'll do it the hard way. Pete, get your crowbar." John didn't see Pete, but heard his affirmative and watched as Ermac unshouldered a black bag, opening it to pull out his own heavy crowbar. One of the other men took off his gloves, wriggling his fingers in between the doors just enough for the crowbars to be inserted. "Don't forget to wipe the prints," John said into the mic. "No shit." Ermac jammed the end of the crowbar in the sliver of space, and Pete did the same. One of the other men sprayed a solution, wiping around with a microfiber cloth as the two men jimmied the doors. There was resistance at first, then the door shuddered and opened with reluctance, revealing an opening in the outer wall that was only a slight step up from the floor of the elevator. "Good job," John said. "Stopped almost dead on." Ermac and his team stepped out. John watched the sway of the camera as Ermac looked around, seeing only the walls and floor, plain and blank. The atmosphere was dark, dusty. The lack of decoration lent a sterile quality to the steel corridor. Ermac whispered, "Any cameras here?" "Sure." "They running?" "Nope." Ermac pulled out a flashlight and clicked it on, prompting the rest to do the same. 4 beams darted around independently as the group made their way along the empty corridor. The security cameras near the ceiling were the only variation in scenery, swiveling back and forth with blind eyes, nothing more than glorified decorations. "Kind of odd," one of the men, perhaps Pete, said. "We haven't seen any real security." "Just cameras," Ermac agreed. John brought up footage from security cameras throughout the building. The images floated across his left eyeball, and he squeezed his right shut to focus on them. There's plenty of security, he noted, switching the images off. They're all on other floors, though. Could be they're not allowed on that floor. Or, hell, maybe they don't even know about it. Ermac nodded. Could be. The flashlight spotted a metal door at the end of the corridor. John watched Ermac's POV approach it and stop. See the keypad? John said. Ermac's gaze went to the square panel beside the door. It was lit with a soft yellow light, displaying 10 numerical keys. 2, 5, 0, 1, John recited. Then, before Ermac could push the buttons, he added, and if that doesn't work, run the fuck out of there because I'm pretty sure an alarm will go off. If it does work, still move your asses because you only have 10 minutes before it resets. You told us that already, Ermac said. John had briefed them earlier. I know I did. Just telling you again. The man punched in the code, unaware of the breath he held in his lungs. There was a split second where nothing happened that felt like an eternity, and John felt certain he was about to witness a hasty retreat via Ermac's camera. Then the light of the panel turned green. There was a pleasant beeping sound, and the door slid open. John exhaled. He heard the others do the same, and withheld a nervous laugh. You're clear, he said. Now hurry. Ermac breezed through the doorway, panning his light around, but then immediately stopped. The hell? Pete whispered. It's like some kind of museum. The man wasn't wrong. The view on the screen showed John another corridor, only this one was flanked on both sides with glass display cases, filing cabinets, and bookshelves containing volumes that looked old and decayed. Ermac's camera moved closer to one, panning down to an open cabinet. There were files of index cards, yellow and disintegrating with age. The camera went up again, and John noted old water damage on most of the books, their pages swollen and warped. Then there were the glass cases. If any of them held anything of value, it was not easily discernible to John. Most of the contents looked either like exhibition pieces from a museum or old sentimental things not even worth touching. One case had a yellowed skull and bits of bone, pieces of some large animal John couldn't make out from the brief glance Ermac gave it. Another display held what appeared to be a miniature cabin, built from a child's log set that looked ancient. It had mostly fallen apart. A thick layer of dust covered everything, save for the contents of the glass cases. Each item seemed foreign, things that belonged in other times and other places. How long has this place been here? One of the men whispered. Not that long, John said into the mic. Maybe all this stuff was brought in from someplace else. The guy's rich, probably owns a bunch of other buildings. But why? Ermac wondered. It all looks like garbage. Who cares? You guys need to get moving. You've only got 9 minutes. Time's wasting. The camera swung back to the center of the strange hallway as Ermac got moving again. They were all bemused when, a few seconds later, they came upon a wooden door with nothing more than a simple brass doorknob and keyhole. This shit's serious? Ermac said, kicking the door. It burst inward, and the team entered a similar hall. More cases, more junk. Ermac kept his gaze fixed ahead as they hurried. John flickered a brief schematic across his eyes. You're coming up on the room, he informed them. It'll have an access terminal somewhere. What's this? One of the men interrupted. Ermac halted, turning around. Pete was standing in front of a dusty display case, wiping at the glass with a gloved hand. Ermac joined the rest as they crowded around the display, and John saw what they were all looking at. Some moldy old pistol. What is it, Pete? Ermac asked. Pete's eyes were filled with wonder. It's a flintlock, he said. John wasn't impressed. Ermac regarded the relic and shrugged, mumbling, Could be worth something, I guess. Who cares? John nearly yelled. It's not what you're there for. Besides, look at the thing. It's rusted all to hell. Total garbage. I mean, come on. Have some fucking class, huh? John was right. The metal was discolored a brownish red, some of it green in places with water damage. What was left of the wooden grip showed hundreds of scratches and deep divots where chunks were missing. But Pete didn't seem to notice or care. Let's nab it, he said, excited. John was shaking his head. Don't you dare waste your time on that fucking thing, he shouted. The men were silent. John grew more tense with each passing second as he thought they were actually going to go for it. Then he saw the camera sway left and right as Ermac shook his head. Forget it, Ermac told Pete. Ain't worth it. Let's go. John breathed a sigh of relief as the POV returned to the center of the hallway. Ermac only got a few strides in, however, before a loud shattering sounded in John's earpiece. John's mouth dropped, his eyes going wide in disbelief. The POV swung sharply back to reveal Pete reaching through the busted glass, plucking the ancient pistol from its pedestal. "Pete, what the hell?" Ermac yelled. John wanted to say the same thing, but he was too upset, his mouth working, but not making any sound. The other man didn't say anything, only stashed the flintlock in his bag and gave Ermac a little shrug. Everybody else just shook their heads. One even had the gall to laugh. John got his voice working. "Forget it," he hissed into the mic. "Just fucking forget about it and move. You've wasted too much time already." Ermac agreed. Motioning to the others, he started to run, and they fell in behind. Before the end of the hallway was in sight, however, John began to hear something odd in his earpiece, a weird, rattling sound. The team heard it too, and slowed. A loud voice suddenly echoed throughout the hallway. John's breath caught in his throat. "Naughty, naughty," the voice shouted. "Playing with Master's things while he's away." Silence. Then the strange sound got louder. No. Sounds. Footsteps, except they were moving fast. Skittering. At first there was nothing. Then they all saw it. Shadows moving on the ceiling, speeding along the walls. The camera jerked back as Ermac recoiled in alarm, and John saw his gun come into view. The other men started firing before he pulled the trigger. John tried to make out what the approaching shadows were, but the flashes of gunfire kept blinding the camera, their loud booms muffling his earpiece. He squinted his eyes. Then he heard a soft click. The sound didn't come from the chaos in the hallway. This was more local, nestled in his ear, inside his head. John's eyes went wide, and he jerked the wire jack from his head without hesitation, shooting from his chair with such force that it flew backwards and fell over. The keyboard fell from his lap, tumbling without a sound to the frayed carpet. He stood and stared at the screen, breathing hard through his nose. The screams in his earpiece came from far away. He watched as the shadows bore down on the men, only now the shadows' forms were blurred, and John knew his worst fear had come to pass. Blinders. Someone had infiltrated his eyes before he could sever the connection. Looking at the situation unfolding on the screen, John knew that the vague blurs speeding towards the men should have been close enough for him to identify. If he had been a touch slower, and if not for certain safeguards he'd installed in his software, the blurred images would now have been completely invisible. The extra money he'd shelled out when he bought his eyes had come in handy, but he was too distracted to thank his good fortune. What else had they done before he pulled the plug? His mind was frantic as he backed away, nearly tripping over the overturned chair as he struggled to think. "Run!" he heard Ermac yell to the others. "Forget about them! Run!" John's hands twisted in his hair. He watched one of the blurs drop from the hallway's ceiling, shooting past Ermac's point of view in the blink of an eye. A spray of blood flew past the camera, and Ermac turned to see the decapitated body of Pete standing upright for a second before tumbling to the floor. "They're coming out of the walls!" one of the men screamed. "They're coming out of the goddamn walls! Let's book!" Ermac turned just in time to see the man's head pop off, blood spurting in a fountain as he dropped. By the time Ermac fled, there were no more screams, only the scurrying shuffles of his pursuers and his own desperate wheezing. There was a quick cutting sound, and Ermac's perspective floated away from his body in an almost whimsical flight, rotating as his head moved through the air in a slow arc. The view jarred as his head landed and rolled, coming to a stop with the camera pointing at his own collapsing body. John ripped the earpiece from his head, flinging it to the floor. The view on the screen cut to black. Looking wildly around his cramped apartment, John realized that he needed to get out of there, as in yesterday. "They traced me," he thought frantically. "They could be on their way right n—" There was a loud bang from the door. John whirled to see it shaking in its frame. Before he could process what to do next, it blew inward and a blurred shape rushed through the opening. Having just witnessed the fate of his clients, John had the good sense to duck just in time. The decapitating appendage of the mysterious attacker flew over his head. John heard the deadly rush of air as it passed. Rolling away, he intended to run through the destroyed doorway, but then a second shape appeared, blocking his exit. John froze, contemplating his options. Problem was, the apartment was a little too small for complicated maneuvers. The bathroom, he thought quickly. He kept a gun in there under the sink. But the second blurry shape was coming for him, cutting him off from that direction, one in front and the other behind. Giving the bathroom up as a lost cause, John turned to see the first blur swipe at him. He twisted out of the way, but felt a sharp pain in his side as it rushed past him to join the other one. "Sliced me open," his mind wailed. "Fucker sliced me open and I'm dead." John looked down, expecting to see guts exiting his side, but only saw a mass of blood seeping through his shirt and a red drooping flower. He clutched the wound and lifted his head, his gaze stopping at his apartment's only window. John rushed forward, one arm shielding his face as he burst through the glass and out onto the fire escape. Landing on the metal grating, he flew into the guardrail, collapsing against it with his stomach as shards of glass flew past him to trickle into the darkness of the alleyway below. The wind was knocked out of him in a painful exhale that he mostly felt in the deep cut in his side, and he would have screamed if he'd had any air left. Not bothering to look back, John sprinted towards the stairs, tripping over himself and sliding down the abrasive grating of each step. A loud bang came from behind. Shoving both hands onto a lower step, ignoring the raw scrapes it left on his palms, he craned his head around to see the same railing that had caught him now bent outward in a broken V shape. One of the mysterious blurs was disengaging from it. A wheeze of fright escaped John's throat, and he tried to scramble to his feet, succeeding only in lifting himself part way before stumbling forward, rolling down the rest of the steps to where the fire escape turned around. Leapfrogging on all fours, John dashed to the next set of steps and rolled down, too crazed with terror to try and regain his feet. The corner of his eye caught one window as its curtains were brushed aside. A curious resident peeked out before immediately rushing the fabric closed, their shadow disappearing so fast it was like they were never there. John could hear the heavy thuds of his pursuers as he made his way down, the flimsy fire escape shaking and bouncing with their combined movement. Reaching the bottom where the metal ladder was drawn up, he shoved himself against it to stop his momentum and chanced a quick glance behind. The blur was less than 10 feet from him, descending the steps, about to round the corner where it would be within arm's reach. No time for the ladder, he decided. He jumped over the side of the rail, falling the remaining 20 feet to the street and landing in a heap of trash that failed to make an adequate cushion. His right foot landed awkwardly on the concrete, and he cried out in searing pain as his ankle twisted. Falling to his side, a giant garbage bag nestled his head like a pungent pillow as he glanced up at the fire escape. The two shapes had gathered by the ladder, appearing to pause for a moment, calculating their next move. John took advantage of their hesitation, stumbling to his feet. He began to limp towards the building in a desperate gait, choosing to double back rather than attempt further escape down the alleyway. There was a reason for this. The gun in the bathroom wasn't the only trick up his sleeve. Even though John was rarely one to plan for the future, occasional cautionary streaks of brilliance did sometimes come to him. He knew that his particular line of work carried certain risks, ones that might prompt a haphazard exit down a fire escape, for instance. When he moved into his dingy apartment 3 years ago, he had cased the building, discovering a loose brick in its outer wall towards the foundation. Prying it loose, John had uncovered a hidden niche. Perfect for hiding a second gun. If he'd been thinking clearly earlier, he would have gone for it the moment the door to his apartment had exploded. But it had been so long ago that he'd forgotten the damn thing was even there. Should be there. Dear God, please let it still be there. Trying to hurry, despite his protesting ankle, John slipped on the wet concrete, only now realizing it was raining as he fought to get back up. A steady downpour fell from the smog that covered the city. The air processors up in the dome were releasing moisture again. Clutching his wound, which had turned his wet shirt a dark shade of pink up and down his right side, the worrying thought of bleeding out drifted through John's mind. Trying to tell himself the foggy feeling in his head was just panic, he inched closer to where the loose brick was located. Passing beneath the fire escape, he heard the heavy thud of one of the descending killers behind him. He fell to his knees at the loose brick. Clawing it from the wall, he quickly thrust a hand inside, feeling the cold wooden grip of the gun, still laying where he had placed it with absent-minded care 3 years ago. He spun around. The dark barrel of the Matiba auto revolver came to bear on the fast-approaching blur. John squeezed the trigger. The recoil from the blast almost knocked the gun from his hand, but his aim held true, and he saw the hazy form jerk back for a moment. It seemed to gather itself as it tried to advance again. John gripped the weapon with both hands, firing 3 more times. Boom! 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 The first shot went wild. The other two punched holes in the thing's body. It stopped, and there was a high-pitched electrical whine as it fell beside him. Not bothering to check if he'd put it out of commission, John stood up as the second blur dropped from the fire escape. It had barely touched the concrete before he lit into it, the roaring gun deafening as it fired. The thing never had a chance to rise. It collapsed backward on the pavement in a shower of sparks like dazzling fireworks. Smoke drifted from destroyed circuitry, and the air was filled with the acrid electrical odor of burning wires. John's chest heaved as he watched the enemy slowly take shape before his eyes, the blinders no longer applying to the dead target. He wasn't surprised to see a shiny chrome body with several holes in its back, each one ringed with small flames as the thing's insides burned. Robots. Fucking machines sent to kill him. He should have done more research on their target. He never would have taken the job if he had. This kind of hardware meant not just money, but cold-blooded vengeance, the kind of eccentric asshole who took to thieves with an extreme prejudice. They'd fucked with the wrong person. I fucked with the wrong person, John moaned, his voice hollow. He dropped the gun. His mind was hazy, incoherent, and it was a struggle to rise, but he did so and started to walk. He circumvented the destroyed machines, still sputtering sparks and smoke, and walked to the mouth of the alley, pausing to look around. He didn't have the faintest idea where to go. The apartment was a bust. Nothing left for him back there save perhaps another visit for more killing machines. Heading left at random, he stumbled along past closed shops, unmindful of the rain coming down in thick drops. Blood continued to pour from his side, but the pain was now coming from far away. His brain seemed to be trying to bring this fact to his attention, but the warning itself was buffered with the thick fog growing in his head. Gotta get off the street, he thought. His head felt like it was full of cotton. The street was deserted. All the traffic disappeared for the night until morning came, and the city would wake and the bustle would begin anew. Vagrants were huddled under any cover they could find, scraps of ragged blankets and plastic clutched around them in feeble attempts to ward off the night's chill. John thought of joining them, maybe trying to blend in, but there was no available space for him. He needed help, medical attention. He was vaguely aware of one of the vagrants calling to him, but was too disoriented to make out the man's words. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His vision was growing dark. The shops and the street were shrinking into a tiny pinprick. John collapsed, the street floating up to meet him, as though sealing off the exit of a long tunnel. At first there was nothing, only a thick darkness, complete without perception or consciousness. Then awareness came to him, as he felt his body bounce and jerk. A voice was counting. It sounded manufactured, disinterested. 6, 7, 8, 9. His body shuddered. The counting restarted. 1, 2, 3. The sequence was quickened as the numbers pierced the haze of his burgeoning consciousness. To John, it sounded almost like singing, the chanting melodic, and he felt the strange urge to nod his head and sing along before his body shook again. He opened his eyes. He was on his back, lying in the street with the rain pattering his face. He squinted and looked over to see a robot stationed beside him. It was a beaten thing, with a skeletal humanoid torso sitting squat on a pair of treads. One arm ticked off each number as it spoke in a monotonous voice, while the other held a paddle to his chest. Every time it reached 9, the defibrillator would fill his body with electric current. Well, it sure as shit ain't singing. Jonathan looked over and saw a second robot. A tube extended from a bag in its fingerless hands as it pumped blood into his body. Lifting his head, he saw an ambulance parked in front of him, its rear doors open. A third robot, this one with actual legs, was slowly pulling out a stretcher. "What?" he croaked. 9. Zap. John tried to lift an arm to ward off the defibrillator, but his hand only moved slightly before dropping again. The machine noted his movement and retracted the paddle, sliding back a few feet before stopping. "Subject is conscious," its mechanical voice whined. "Measuring blood pressure," the other beeped, sliding over to him. Wires extended from one of its hands and wrapped around his arm. He felt them tighten. "Blood pressure nominal, ready for extraction." Despite the frail appearance of the robot's appendages, they managed to lift him onto the stretcher. A few impoverished onlookers lined the street, watching as he was wheeled away. John noticed one, standing out in the middle of the street in the pouring rain, as he looked on anxiously. "Thought you were a goner," the man said. John mumbled, "Thought I was too," as he was lifted into the back of the ambulance. "Thanks." The doors closed and the vehicle began speeding away. John wasn't sure what hospital they were taking him to, but it didn't matter. He had no intention of going to one. He laid back and let the robots patch up his side, stitching the wound as the ambulance slowly tilted and swerved. When they were finished, the robots relaxed, seeming to go into some sort of standby mode. John took special care to avoid ripping his stitches as he wormed his way out of the stretcher's straps, then moved forward and lifted the latch on the rear doors. They swung open, and he saw wet pavement flying past. Waiting for the ambulance to slow down as it turned a corner, he jumped out, tucking and rolling as he landed, all knees and elbows as he bounced along the asphalt before coming to a stop, bruised in a half-dozen places and breathing heavily into the cement. John raised his head and looked around. He didn't recognize the neighborhood, but that didn't worry him. He could get directions later. Wincing, holding his side, he got to his feet and started to walk again. The rain had passed, the night replaced with the cold light of day, which shined under the dome of the city through a pale gray curtain. A typical morning in New Junk City, the dome itself was obscured by the perpetual smog. The pollution gave credence to the illusion that there was no barrier separating the city from the outside world. Jonathan Derringer boarded the A train. He made his way along one of the cars, stepping around discarded garbage and plastic bags which held the entire belongings of their owners. He found a seat among a small group of passengers. The train circled the city while he tried to determine what his next step should be. The passenger next to him touched his shoulder. "Do you know him?" the person asked. John turned to see an old man, his wild hair and beard unkempt and discolored brown from long settled dirt. The man was looking at him and pointing to the seat across the way. It was empty. John shook his head and said nothing, disengaging himself from any potential conversation with the crazy man as he continued to contemplate his current state of affairs. He realized that someone had given him a second chance. Whether that someone was God or something else, some other force, John didn't know. But he did know one thing. He had to get out of New Junk City. It was over for him here. Nothing left to do now but get out. "I'm through with this shit," he thought to himself. Catching a subterranean train to another city was expensive, but John was confident that trading back his eyes and hawking the module in his head would cover the cost. He stroked the bandages wrapped around his stomach as he thought. For the first time since the night before, John felt a calm settle over him, not just because he was thankful to still be alive, but because once again he had a plan. And that plan was escape. He was not going to squander this second chance. John leaned his head forward, chin resting on his chest, and closed his eyes. A man was in fact sitting in the seat opposite John. He stood up and walked to the end of the train car, moving away from the other passengers. John's dozing figure was still in his view. The man brushed a hand across a small square of silicon embedded just above his right eye. "Mr. Aldrin," he spoke with a soft voice. A voice responded in his head, this one cold and direct. "Yes, Jaden. Have you found our wayward thief?" "The blinders your boy hit him with last night are functioning properly now. We're on the A train. He can't see me." "Are you sure?" "I waved to him when he got on. No response. One of the other passengers almost gave me away, but thankfully he didn't realize." "Could he be faking?" "Doubtful. I think that might be giving him too much credit. Not much more than a bum, this one. It's a miracle he even survived the night. I imagine him and his friends didn't know who they were involving themselves with when they tried to steal from you." Jaden's dry laughter reached a passenger halfway down the car. They glanced at him, but quickly turned away once they realized the man they were looking at clearly didn't belong on that train, and they had no desire to find out what he was doing there. "Do you anticipate any problems?" Mr. Aldrin asked. "None at all. Would you believe that he's sleeping right now? Probably thinks he got away, poor fellow. No, I'll finish up here shortly. Care to take lunch after?" "Sounds splendid. My thanks to you, Jaden. You never disappoint. This particular situation has been rather vexing, to say the least. People don't often get away from me, you understand. And when this one did, I was very upset. A word of advice, if I may, Jaden offered. Please. Never send machines to do a man's job. The two said their goodbyes, and the man disconnected. An hour later, John stirred from his slumber. He looked around with bleary eyes as the train reached its next stop and got up. Exiting through the sliding doors and breathing the morning's crisp, refreshing air, he was unaware of the man who exited the train, just behind him. The end.